All right, everybody, welcome back. Um, Again, check out my website, dancethecosmos.com. My name is Dan Hendricks, and well, thank you for watching this video. I appreciate it. So in this video, we're going to talk about something that is a very, very simple and basic concept of astrology, but can be easily overlooked. And it brings out a lot of information in charts. And I know for me personally, it's really expanded once I started thinking about this and going over it and applying it to charts, it's really expanded my understanding of analyzing charts and like I said, understanding, just gaining a greater understanding. Because what we're talking about here is we're talking about the nature of the opposite signs from each other and what that can indicate and what that helps us to learn about things. And whenever we see combinations of like a planet in the seventh from its own house. So first, before we get into that aspect of a planet in the seventh from its own sign, let's first just talk about what we're looking at. So first, let's just look at this chart and let's define what opposite means. Okay, so here we go. All right, so let's just start with Aries. So looking at Aries, the opposite sign of Aries is Libra, because that's the opposite sign. That's the seventh sign. And any sign that's the seventh sign is literally the furthest away. It represents 180 degrees away from that planet, you know. And when we talk about turning 180, it's like turning all the way around, right? It's like going from the front of something to the back of something. And what we'll see here is every sign that has a planet every sign that has, you know, the opposite sign from it is going to tell us more, help us understand that sign more, because we can look at the other sign as the opposite and as the opposite meaning. So with Aries, we'll see here the opposite of Aries is Libra, and opposite of Taurus is Scorpio, opposite of Gemini is Sagittarius, opposite of Cancer is Capricorn, opposite of Leo is Aquarius, opposite of Virgo is Pisces, and vice versa. So what you see here is there's really 6 polarities to understand. So what's kind of cool about this idea, when you break it down into opposites, you can really realize, instead, I don't have to memorize 12 signs, I got to memorize 6 signs. Now, it's not necessarily true, because each sign provides just a absolute wealth of information, but the underlying gist of what that sign represents, if you understand what Aries represents, you can better understand Aries by understanding what Libra is and how Libra actually can represent the opposite of Aries, and vice versa, by understanding what Libra means first, and then by analyzing what Aries means and putting it in the context of what the opposite of Libra is. That helps you better understand and appreciate what Libra's indications are. It's really a fascinating study. So let's just get into a real quick, brief example of that, since we're talking about Aries and Libra. So what is Aries? So let's look at the symbols of these 2 signs of Aries and Libra. So Aries is the ram, right? Aries is being very headstrong and being very sure about what it wants to do. And it's about being very sure-footed, and being very sure-footed because it's the goat. Well, there's 2 things to look at. It's either you can look at it as a goat, or you can look at it as a ram that's charging forward. Either way, I look at it as 2 different ways, as a ram charging forward and as a mountain goat. So Aries is very sure-footed, and Aries as the ram. I look at both of these indications really as meaning the same thing, as either looking at it as like a mountain goat that climbs very steep surfaces, or as a ram that's charging at you. Both of those are going to be where they're going to go. You know, like there's no stopping it. A mountain goat, it can go up any angle or slope. You can basically, it almost seems like these things defy gravity, right? Because if they decide that they're going to go chew on that plant, regardless of how steep that slope is, they're just going to walk there, because there's nothing stopping them from getting them to where they want to go. There's no slope. There's no amount of uphill that that's going to stop them. And the same thing with the ram that's charging forward. That energy is just very headstrong and forward. And both of these, it's like I'm not thinking of anything else. And if you know anything about goats, goats eat everything. Goats will, if you put a goat in a field, in a yard, and let's say that yard has 6 plants, that goat won't be like, well, you know, I'm just naturally only going to eat 2 of those plants and let the other 4 grow and let them get bigger, and then I'll only eat the low lying branches. No, that goat will eat all 6 of those plants all the way down to the root, kill them all. Because the goat doesn't, the idea of the energy of Aries is to be impulsive, to charge forward, to go ahead, and no real regard for consequences. You know, and Aries is also a fire sign, and fire signs mean it's talking about the self. It's about who the person is, you know, and it's about me doing what I need to do. Now, when we talk about Libra, Libra is the scales. It's always weighing one thing against another thing. Libra represents, because it's ruled by Venus also, Libra represents other people. It represents relationships. It's about give and take. It's about always realizing that every action I take has an equal and opposite reaction, right? It's about diplomacy. It's about fair trade. It's about being in a marketplace of other people. It's about considering others, considering the results of our actions, of being more thoughtful and present about the choices that we make. Where Aries is about being more about impulsive, and it's about me. And Libra's an air sign, and air signs are always more socially driven. And then air signs are also about intelligence, intelligence, yes, but information. So Libra, it's like, well, let me see what the facts are. All right, let's see how this weighs. How do I feel about whether this is the right thing to do or not? Aries, on the other hand, is just like, nope, that's the one way I'm going. So that's how we can see these 2 signs here represent opposite energies. And if you go all the way around, I'm not going to take the time to go through all the signs to do this. I mean, honestly, that would have to be a whole other video. But this is the idea of how we can start to understand these things. And then what do we know about these polarities when I say 180 degrees away from each other? So anytime you have the ascendant in a sign, that's the ascendant's the first house. The 7th house is always, obviously, the 7th sign away. The 7th house is always the opposite of the first house. And so another word for the first house is the ascendant. Another word for the 7th house is the descendant, because these represent the horizon points when we were born, right? So let's say the ascendant is in Aries. That means that when we were born, if you stared off in the eastern horizon, you looked this way, then you would see that the constellation of Aries, and this would be the sign that is getting brighter in the sky, that's rising into the sky. Now, on the other hand, if you were to look towards the western horizon, at the sign that is setting at that time, that is disappearing from view, that is setting, that is going below the horizon of our view, you know, that would be known as the descendant. So if it were Aries, if you looked over here and it was Aries on the eastern horizon, which would give us the rising sign or the ascendant of Aries, then Libra would be the setting sign. And so what we can know is, so if the ascendant is what's rising into the sky, and it's rising into, so it's about who we're becoming, who we are. It has a nature or a certain indication of the person, of our individual experience. Well, then the 7th, well, and also if the ascendant in the first house represents our path in life, right, and where we're at in our path in life and us from our perspective, the 7th house then represents other people's perspectives. The 7th house represents where we're headed to, where we're going to end up, where we're going to. And so when we talk about this polarity of these 2 signs, not only are they opposite, these signs are also about finding balance. And not just because Libra represents the scales in this particular example, But what it is so if Aries is here, this means that where we're headed in our path in life, if Aries is our ascendant, which is, like I said, makes us, a headstrong nature and, maybe even impulsive in how we go about things. Well, this means that where we're headed and where we need to go in life is to learn to balance that by learning to take in consideration other people, because of the idea of the sign of the first house, which is Aries, and the sign of the seventh house, which is Libra. And then what do we also know? So we talk about the ascendant, descendant. And the reason why I talk about balance, I always think about balance, is because of the nature of the nodes, the nature of Ketu and Rahu. And so let's say in the same example, where we have Ketu now in Aries and Libra, and then Rahu in Libra. Well, what Ketu represents coming into this current manifestation, into this lifetime. From our past lives, what we had is we relied too much on the Aries nature. And that's somewhere earlier in life we're always going to fall back on being that headstrong, initiative person, only thinking of themselves. And then Rahu in Libra shows that basically we relied so much on Aries in our past incarnations that in this particular incarnation, well, Ketu is going to tell us in this particular incarnation, we're going to get involved in situations where acting that way, trying to take care of things ourselves, just is not going to, it's going to be disappointing. It's not going, even though we're going to have skill doing it, even though we're going to be able to manage our lives in that particular area of life represented by the house that falls in Aries, it's going to bring disappointment. It's never going to be as fulfilling. It's going to bring kind of even doubts as to, why am I even bothering to try this? It's not feeling right. And then Rahu and Libra shows, because Rahu shows us where karmically in our lifetime, where that area that we need to go to find balance, to resolve that issue of where Aries is, or where Ketu is at. So with Rahu and Libra, that shows that this lifetime it's going to be new to the individual to be working with other people, accepting help, asking other people for advice, using other people to help them out along their own path. And the reason why I bring up Ketu and Rahu is because ultimately what Ketu and Rahu are is about finding a balance. Because Ketu is about resolution, but Ketu has to use Rahu to find resolution. And that's ultimately the goal of Rahu and Ketu, is that, so Ketu, we're trying to resolve this issue about us trying to do everything ourselves with Ketu and Aries. And then Rahu is going to show that we're unfamiliar with it. We're going to act in weird ways. Sometimes we're going to be confused about how we use Rahu. So Rahu and Libra, it's going to be like, I don't really even know how to let other people help me. And then maybe Rahu represents extremes, so maybe I go to extremes with the wrong group of people trying to help me with this one thing where they're kind of incapable of even being able to do that until you settle in. And eventually what you learn with Ketu and Rahu is with Ketu you eventually learn how to operate yourself and be an independent person who gets what he needs to get done by doing only what you need to do, that only you can do, and letting the other people fill in the other roles for you. So, and that's why, and then when we take this into consideration, this nature of Rahu and Ketu of providing balance, and Ketu and Rahu are always 180 degrees opposite each other in the chart. So this shows us that every time we look at one point, that the other point is there as the potential balancing factor of that sign. So whatever you know of the energy of a sign, if you know that Virgo is related to making things better in the world in a very practical sense, and you know that Pisces represents, completion. Pisces represents seeing the bigger picture of life and how everything is all interconnected and just surrendering to the flow of what is. And then you can start to measure how these are opposites, but you can measure how these are also a balance of the other one, right? So Virgo person could be overly practical, And by using the energy of Pisces, they can learn to, instead of me having to fix everything, I can know that I'm part of a whole solution. You know, I can just surrender to it all. And by surrendering to what is, it helps me make the world a better place. And so with that being said, another thing I think about when I think about these opposites, though, so we've talked about the opposite nature of each of these signs, and we talked about the balance that each opposite sign can help bring the other sign. But what's fascinating that I see about these is that if you look through all of these signs, you know, from Aries, from Libra, so let's talk about the planets that rule these signs. Well, okay, so Mars and Venus, right? So Mars rules Aries, Venus rules Libra. Well, Mars and Venus are natural neutral planets. And the point that I'm making is in every single opposite situation you see here between Gemini, Sag, Aries, Libra, Taurus, Scorpio, etc., all of the opposite signs it's never a natural friend and it's never an exaltation place. A planet never is exalted or in a natural friend sign when it's in the 7th from its own sign. It's absolutely fascinating. So what that shows is if you were to have Mars in Libra, what that shows is that it's not a natural setting for that planet to be 7 signs away from its own sign. It's not necessarily guarantee of greater difficulty, although that is always a possibility with a planet in the 7th, is there's always more difficulties. So now, if you're thinking about a planet in the 7th from itself, what does that mean? Well, what can happen if you had Mars in Libra? Well, that could be, especially if this is the first house. So if this is the first lord in the 7th, well, this is definitely someone that gets more involved with other people. This is also someone who is going to be overly balanced in the opposite nature of what their original sign is. So by having Mars in Libra, especially like I said, if it's the first lord in the 7th house, you know, it's other people being more of an influence in their lives. Instead of them just naturally acting about what they want to do, it's about like, oh, what do you think I should do here? You know, should I, you know, it's relying on others, wanting their approval almost. And so it's a real fascinating situation, because then now if we look on the opposite end here, we can look at Jupiter. If Jupiter, the Lord of Sagittarius, is in Gemini, well, that is in a natural enemy sign. So that's going to be a difficult place, no matter what, with Jupiter as the Lord of Sagittarius in Gemini, or Jupiter as the Lord of Pisces in Virgo. Both of those situations are going to be a difficult situation for that Jupiter to manifest its energy. And so that's what I thought is interesting, because it's the furthest away from its particular sign. And that's also like the furthest away, but it's also that balancing point. And so with Jupiter here in Gemini as the Lord of Sagittarius, well, that just tells us that it's overly involved in the opposite thing. So that's just an interesting thing. The more and more I study these opposite signs, the more and more stuff that comes up. Another thing about opposite signs, and this has a lot to do with Saturn and Rahu, and this can happen with any planet also, is this idea of compensation. You know, if you've got an afflicted planet, or you have like Saturn and Gemini, then sometimes what happens, or maybe Rahu and Gemini, sometimes what happens is we'll tend to act, but the way that we tend to act to compensate for a Gemini, sometimes what it is, we'll compensate by using the opposite sign, the energy from the opposite sign, or the energy in the house that is opposite. So if Gemini is the 3rd house, And maybe we have Saturn here, which makes us which makes us a little bit like our communications not great or something like that. Then instead of just like knowing that, you know, I don't trust my information or my process, maybe that'll make a person become more Sagittarius like, more driven, you know, to try and cover up that Gemini. They'll try and show that they can go forward with what they're doing. So it doesn't always work that way, but that's just a possibility. And that's something to always consider. It's always important to consider that opposite sign, because there's so much information that can be gleaned from a chart by studying the ascendant and the descendant, the first and the seventh, and then the relationship when you see planets in the seventh from their own sign and the seventh from their own house. Very interesting. There's so much more. I could go on and on and on about this. Maybe I should have made this into a whole series of videos, but I find this to be a very valuable reference and a very valuable tool and technique to further understanding in a deeper way each sign, each house, right? And every chart you look at. So thank you for taking the time to watch this, and namaste.